it's a network for people who are really interested in the intersection between mindfulness and social, economic, and environmental justice, and are interested in thinking about how mindfulness can support our endeavours towards justice, but also how activists and change makers can also benefit from having practices which support the inner work which is necessary to make change happen.
Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up.
I often get the question, well, who is doing innovative and leading edge work on social and civic mindfulness? Who's teaching mindfulness outside of the clinical, biomedical, and individualistic framework? And I kept hearing Paula Haddock's name pop up. Paula is a longtime social activist and has spent many years working in nonprofit fundraising with many NGOs and is a seasoned training manager. She's worked worldwide in supporting civil society in capacity building. She is also co-founder of the Mindfulness and Social Change Network, which is a collective of international academics, activists, humanitarian workers, and socially engaged mindfulness practitioners who are exploring the potential for secular mindfulness training and practice to contribute to more sustainable, caring, and socially just societies. David Forbes in Brooklyn joins me in this episode, in which we explore with Paula her unique social framework for teaching mindfulness, along with her work with the ULEX project, which delivers training on movement building, impact, and resilience for European-based change makers, as well as her work with Eco-Dharma training. We also touch on a number of other issues, such as the issue of whiteness in mindfulness communities, cancel culture, and even our reactions to Trump getting COVID. Paula has delivered social mindfulness-related sessions for the Atlantic Fellows Program, University College London, the Mindfulness Association, and she's written for Transformation series of Open Democracy, several articles which we have on our website, Mindfulness and Social Change, and Don't Wait for the Future of Mindfulness, It's Already Here. I hope you enjoy this episode as Paula Haddock joins us from her home in Oxford, England. Well, welcome to our podcast, Paula. We have Paula Haddock here on the Mindful Cranks, and David Forbes is back with us for this particular episode. So thank you both for joining us here.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, David has a history with Paula. I guess you two have met. Why don't we just start very informally? How did you two meet? I mean,
that's a really good question. I was thinking about that today, David, and all I remember is having dinner in a restaurant in Aberystwyth. It was a mindfulness conference in Wales? Mindfulness?
Yes, in fact, I have it right here. Paula was a participant. They actually invited me to be a keynote speaker. I get to be a keynote speaker in my own apartment for my wife, but this was the conference was called Mindfulness, Adaptations, Ethics, and Impact, an all Wales event, even though Paula and I are not Welsh. And this was in September 2016.
Wow.
And I remember Paula was a participant, so I had the pleasure of meeting her there.
It doesn't feel that long ago, David.
Yeah, I
know. How fast time flies.
So Paula, tell us a little bit about maybe how did you venture into the minefield of mindfulness, and what's your background? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I've spent probably the best part of 15 years working in sort of international development, more broadly, perhaps civil society sort of spaces. So I worked for Oxfam GB for about 4 years, and then I went to work for another civil society strengthening organisation called INTRAC, which was a training, research, and consultancy organisation that did work to basically support NGOs, international NGOs, civil society organisations to be stronger, and it did that through training, through doing things like evaluations, and through supporting the sector with research. So I spent 6 years as their training manager. And sometime within that time of working with them, I had always done a lot of reading about Buddhism, and I've been a long-term yoga practitioner. And I guess what I would say is I think I sort of really wanted to understand Buddhism, but I found either it too some of the concepts so simple that I didn't sort of capture them, or some of them too overwhelming and too sort of mind altering, and got lost. And so I started reading some sort of more popularized sort of forms of Buddhism, let's say, and secular mindfulness, things like The Power of Now, Mindfulness in Plain English. I read Mark Williams' book, The Frantic World, and that really had an impact on me. I really felt that I was sort of getting to grips and understanding what I had been spending quite a lot of time reading about, but never really sort of fully appreciating, or particularly not sort of being able to use as a practice for myself. So I started practicing a mindfulness, both a sort of secularized form of mindfulness, in that I did sort of an 8-week course, but also had this sort of background in reading about Buddhism and being a yoga practitioner as well. So sort of feeling the benefits of both of those. And then I was, obviously working in international development and feeling a sort of quite a high level of frustration about the way in which the sector felt like it was sort of falling prey to a lot of the sort of capitalist, consumerist, neoliberal sort of agenda. And I was seeing that very much as a training manager, the way that capacity building and training would be funded, the way in which organizations might compete with each other for funding rather than sort of collaborate, these sorts of things. And I was feeling that I really wanted I was feeling that mindfulness was really sort of helping me to see that more clearly, and think about how to sort of be more value led, and have those values sort of really come out in our ways of working. And so I always had a sort of social view of mindfulness quite early on from my sort of introduction to mindfulness. I went on to become a mindfulness teacher. I studied at Bangor while still working for the NGO sector, and then again there also found this sort of lack of a sort of social lens of mindfulness. So I got quite quickly into looking at social mindfulness and came across a lot of your work and the work of others. And that's sort of where I've continued from that point onwards.
So it sounds like you came to mindfulness already with a very sort of established, maybe not established is the right word, but a social justice lens that influenced your way of thinking about mindfulness programs and so forth. Is that fair?
Absolutely, for sure. And I found it really difficult to be trained within a university where that sort of lens wasn't really it wasn't understood fully. It wasn't embraced, not because it wasn't seen as important, but I think that there just wasn't the people just didn't have a background. There was obviously a lot of teachers with a clinical background, and I felt a little bit sort of isolated in that space as somebody who was coming from a really strong social justice background, working within civil society within NGOs, and had worked with hundreds of organisations from across the world on this as part of my role in capacity building, and I just found it really difficult to think about things like the idea of universal suffering when my lens for so long had been looking at social inequalities and how that plays out differently, and how that can be shifted. And so that made studying sort of, I still found the course very very good. I think it was a rigorous sort of way of training me in that particular form of mindfulness, but what was sort of missing was this social lens. And I was fortunate enough in 2013 to go to a space. I live in Oxford. There's actually a very sort of strong activist social change scene here in Oxford, and a friend of mine had been to Eco Dharma. It's got a now sister project called the ULEX project, but at the time I went to the space called Eco Dharma, which was based in Spain, and did a course called Engage Buddhism, and it was revelatory because it really combined. It's an organization set up by people who are activists, who are change makers, and who have a Buddhist practice, and it delivers training courses which brings together the sort of intersection of inner work, social change, and a strong nature connection. It's in the middle of a phenomenally beautiful part, very remote part of Spain. And going to that course on Engaged Buddhism made me realize this is the type of mindfulness that I want to teach. And I felt that it was important to offer some form of more secularized course, because I knew that would appeal to a broader audience. But I still felt that was possible to do with a strong sort of ethical dimension, a strong critical analysis dimension, and the inner work. And that really was a really life-changing moment for me. I quit my job. I went to live with them for 9 months in the community, and I worked with G from Eco Dharma to design a new course called Mindfulness and Social Change, which we've delivered every year for 5 years. But all of the courses at Eco Dharma, and now also their sister project, the ULEX project, all integrate a really strong focus on inner work as well as outer change, which is sort of where I feel that's where I want to sit.
I think David's going to come back and ask you a little bit more about the ULEX and the Eco Dharma projects. But before we do, I have a very curious question. Going back into your earlier career when you were working with a lot of NGOs, and reflecting back on that, what did you see as some of the most challenging or the most formative experiences that really shaped your sort of social activist outlook? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, these might not be the sorts of answers you expect, but I worked a long time in fundraising within the charity sector at the beginning. I used to do a lot of, when I started out, I didn't really know what I had to offer within the sector. So I started out doing telephone fundraising of all things, and I actually was quite good at it. I was quite good at getting money, quite good at talking to people and encouraging them to give money to various charities. And I ended up managing a team and starting to do training on things like that. So I really had a strong understanding of how, what sort of things people would give money to, and also why they would stop giving their money. And then I went to work in another area of the organization where they were responsible for sort of raising money, but also spending money. And I just could see how this money was being spent in a way that I just, it just made me so, just made my heart sink at thinking about how hard it was for us to raise that money in one team, and how easy it was to spend it in another in ways that perhaps, I don't know if they had as much value or as much impact as they could have. And I think when I left the international NGO sector, one of the things I've enjoyed most about working more with grassroots organizations is this sort of, there is no money. It's a really sort of, there isn't a lot of money. And I think in a way, I really enjoyed I don't want to say that NGOs and the civil society sector doesn't have a lot of integrity. Of course it does. But when you work in an activist organization or groups or movements, there's just so much more appreciation of every cent or every pound that you get your hands on, and people are giving a lot of time voluntarily. People's lives are really there's a lot more sort of integration between why people are doing that work and their home lives, and I really felt that there was also a lot of creativity and a lot of need to collaborate and cooperate with other organizations, because none of you had the same access to resource. And in the NGO sector, you feel a lot that there is a lot of like actually having to compete for space. I mean, it's not the NGOs sort of fault, if you like. It's the way that the architecture of aid is set up in such a way that charities are encouraged to compete with each other for very limited funding, and so that sets up this sort of this competitive edge, and the need to be sort of have ownership over particular ideas or campaigns or and I really enjoyed actually working in a space where resources were much more limited, creativity had to be really high, and there was a real need, there was a real codependence actually. And to some extent, we did manage to do that. I work with an amazing group of training providers. We set up our own informal training providers forum, for example, between the 10 training providers that effectively may have been competing with each other, or certainly had the potential to. And we informally came together to work out how to not compete and actually work more together. And that's still going today, 10 years on. So there were some really good examples of that. But those were some of the things that I sort of felt a concern about. Also other things like, I've been a training manager for a long time. I really care about capacity building, and in a system where you're effectively needing to do your work in a very short time frame. So you need to make change happen very quickly, and projects take a long time to set up and run. And so the shorter time frame means that you can't really develop like really longer term theories of how change is going to happen, particularly at any significant sort of structural level. It's much harder to do that when you're doing a project of sort of 1 or 2 years. It was around the nature of sort of measurement. So I did a lot of work on monitoring the evaluation of training, and this idea that you have to measure the sorts of changes that are being made. You have to say what types of change is going to happen, and you have to be able to measure it. And that was also so limiting to the idea of how change happens. It didn't allow for a lot of transformative change or a lot of sort of longer term inquiry or working with communities or with staff on what type of change might be needed. And it meant that, you end up doing courses or designing courses that are sort of the most measurable, which means that maybe you don't do the work that's more important, like some of the sort of social dynamics. So I sort of brought all of that thinking into the mindfulness world, if you like, sort of coming from an NGO background, that I can't help but bring all of that kind of thinking in. So, for example, with the 8-week course, one thing that I find really challenging is like I spent a long time working on sort of best practice around capacity building. And the first thing you do is you think about, why do you want to make change happen? Who for and what change? And so if you're taking a pre-designed course, that's very difficult to do, especially if you're trying to maintain a particular rigor of training the course in a particular way. So those are the sorts of things that sort of rubbed me and sort of challenged me from getting involved in sort of the mindfulness-based practices.
Can you say a bit more about that, though? I mean, in terms of the link between the frustration you felt about change and measurement, and how does that link up with the mindfulness? Did you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I guess I'm always thinking about the sort of, I try and always think about the bigger picture. So, for example, if somebody's talking about, whether it's good that we ran a course, a mindfulness course in a particular setting, let's say in schools or in prisons, my question is always, okay, but what thinking happened before that? Where did we decide we wanted to make the change happen? And who decided that? Because those would be the things I'd want to know, because that would change what I was going to measure. So I'm sort of, in a way, less interested in, did the mindfulness training create a particular change in an individual, whilst that is important, but I'm also interested in who trained and who was taught and what change did that result in? Was that the change that was really needed? So, for example, we might do training for mindfulness in prisons, and my question might be, okay, but are we doing training of prison staff, or are we doing training of like people in the judiciary who might have a bias around the way in which they give sentences, or those sorts of things. So I'm trying to always understand the sort of the system as a whole, and where do we want change to happen, and then are we sort of measuring that. So that's not so much about how we measure change, but it's about sort of what type of change are we measuring.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit. I hear a lot about ULEX, and you are now working quite a bit with the ULEX project. What is the ULEX project, and what's unique about it?
And is that related to the Eco Dharma? Is that?
Yeah, so Eco Dharma has been running for a long time, I'd say over a decade. And a few years ago, actually, when I went to live there, they were thinking about setting up a second centre called the ULEX Project. Partly because the courses were proving very popular, and they ran nature connection based courses at the same time as courses related to Buddhism and courses related to sort of more sort of social change skills, let's say, like transformative collaboration, which is one of the courses that I have the good fortune to teach on. And that was a lot to train in from one centre. So there was always this idea of thinking about being able to expand, and Eco Dharma has been really successful in getting funding actually from the European Union to run courses for people to come from all over Europe to train there. And so the idea was to set up a new centre and in another house, another property that they had, and to use that as a place to run the more sort of secular and sort of social justice focused courses. And then the nature connection courses have stayed in the original Eco Dharma site. And it's a really phenomenal place. I suppose why I love working there, and I'm really happy to recommend people to go there, is because of this really clear and explicit acknowledgement that inner and outer change are really vital to each other. If we can't make outer change without doing some inner work on ourselves, because we are part of the system. We've been socialized in a particular way. We live in, we have particular backgrounds. We're subject to our culture, our history, our politics, and if we want to make change happen, it's really important that we sort of understand ourselves as a socialized being, and see what it is that we also manifest, and to also think about sort of how we take care of ourselves. So thinking about things like being burnt out or being overwhelmed, or dealing with a lot of the really difficult emotions that come up from doing activism work, caring about the world, caring about people, gives rise to a lot of very difficult emotions: overwhelm, anger, grief, frustration, the need for patience. It's such a difficult space to be in. And on top of that, you're also collaborating and working with others. So there's this real appreciation that it's really difficult to work with other people. You have to look at other people's points of view. You have to be able to deal with the ways in which we might trigger each other. You have to be able to have ideas, but also make decisions together, and the challenges around that. So, and also you're doing that within a context where we are effectively as a species destroying our natural environment, and so you're also thinking about our disconnect from nature and how we can be reconnected with nature and reconnected with ourselves and our own embodiment. So it's a place where every course they run and everybody they work with has this kind of understanding of the importance of the intersection between these things, and that comes out in every course that they run. And also there's a community that lives there who are also sort of living these values and principles together. So that's why I've enjoyed working so much with them.
Do you see a trend in that direction in the mindfulness field in terms of the acknowledgement of the inner and the outer, the social and the personal? I mean, you said you studied at Bangor. You might say a bit about, some people aren't familiar with that with their program, but we're always curious to, are we seeing more of that happening in the field?
Yeah, it's a good question. So back in the early days of practicing and starting to teach mindfulness, I set up something called the with Luke Wreford, the Mindfulness and Social Change Network. And so as you know, because you're both part of it, it's a network for people who are really interested in the intersection between mindfulness and social, economic, and environmental justice, and are interested in thinking about how mindfulness can support our endeavours towards justice, but also how activists and change makers can also benefit from having practices which support the inner work which is necessary to make change happen. And so we started that in about 2013. And that was fantastic because from being somebody who was kind of a little bit frustrated during my studies about not being able to really have these conversations in the space or really feel that anybody was really kind of getting this angle, from just starting to have conversations, we quite quickly found people. So quite early on we met Rachel Lilly, who I know some of you know, I think perhaps both of you know, and her work on behavioral insights. And then we fortunately met Stephen Stanley as well, and Meg John Barker, who had already been doing quite a lot of work in this sector. So they were way ahead of us. And then obviously eventually we came across you both, and we've realised that there are a lot of people who are concerned about this. But in those early days of the network, I would say I wasn't hearing so much about these issues, and the moments when they would come up, they would be sort of very fringe. They wouldn't come up so much in mainstream conferences. I wouldn't be reading so much. If anything, we started being sort of contributors to really what I felt at the time was that there really wasn't a space being created to have these kinds of conversations, and that's partly because of the nature of, as I mentioned before, of organizations, how there can, I don't know, I feel a little bit like sometimes it's difficult to accept or discuss critique, and sometimes the spaces aren't made for that to happen. And so that's why we set the network up, really was like an open space, highly accessible, free, low barrier of entrance. You just have to practice mindfulness and be interested and engaged in social, economic, or environmental justice, or want to make a contribution there. And then we just started to build this space for people to have conversations. And so since then, we've been growing slowly because we've just been sort of meeting people through word of mouth, and now there's over 400 members from around the world. And as you can see from sort of all the recent articles on open democracy, I think there's a real appetite for this now. So I have seen a real difference over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, with people starting to click that there is really something here, and it is really important. And partly that's because of because of climate change and the devastating effect that we're having on the climate, and how important that is, and how that's got to be a priority for all of us. And partly it's because of just a lot of tireless work of people trying to do work on issues like racial justice. This has sort of become more in the limelight now in the last sort of year, but actually there are members of the network that have been doing work on this for decades. And but now there's a sort of acknowledgement that we need to be talking about this. So I think there's been a lot of hard graft by a lot of people over a long period of time, including yourselves, and people coming at it from different angles, trying to influence and engage in different types of ways. That's now led to there being a greater acknowledgement. But I would still say
we'll put on our website some links to. You mentioned the several articles that you wrote for Transformation in the Open Democracy Network. We will definitely link to those, and to the Mindfulness and Social Change Network for our listeners who would like to explore those resources further.
Great. And I just want to have a little flag up that I'm not a great writer. So whilst these are a lot of my ideas and conversations, Luke Wreford and who I wrote one of them with, and G, are definitely the prominent writers of these. I'm more of a talker, and they're excellent writers. So just putting a shout out there for them.
No, you're doing a lot of great work. Did you? I'm remembering there were some conferences that the Mindfulness and Social Change Network set up, and also, well, yes, and the series of articles that Ron and I have a few in that. And the other thing you mentioned about racism, it seems I'm noticing there's more work on whiteness. Is that sort of become a trend in the UK?
I don't know if I'd say trend, but certainly, yeah.
That's not a good word. It's just that sounds like a commodity or something.
Yeah, so I mean, quite a number of us have been doing some work on thinking about understanding our racialization as white people, and actually using our mindfulness practice as a way of sort of adding that sort of, well, both having the sort of critical analysis, which is so key, I think, and also the mindfulness practice together to kind of understand and dismantle the ways in which we hold systems of repression within us, in the way that we think, in the way that we have embodied emotions, and we have particular behaviors around those emotions, ways of dealing with our emotions, and ways of sort of being with and responding in spaces and with others and within organizations to systemic racism. So yeah, a couple of us, a few of us have been doing work in different groups. In fact, not so long ago, I had an open conversation with quite a few different groups, particularly some groups that had come out of different Buddhist traditions, and some of us have come out of more of an activist tradition, and some come out of a secular mindfulness tradition. Some people all came together to talk about how is it we've been going about doing that work. And actually, I recently heard that there is some work happening with what has been sort of called whiteness, is sort of dismantling of white supremacy within the mindfulness community in the UK. So there is more of an understanding of the need to do work on racial justice at a sort of institutional level within mindfulness organisations in the UK, which is really important to do. And I just wanted to go back to something else you mentioned, David, as well, which was around the conferences, because I think that's something that's really been of interest to those of us who have a sort of more of a social mindfulness perspective. A lot of what we're interested in is sort of how these structures have been set up, structures to practice mindfulness, structures to teach mindfulness, or structures to talk about our work. It's in sort of the structures where power dynamics sort of play out, and where some voices get heard over others, or some sort of traditions get prioritized over others, or some just don't even get mentioned. So we're quite interested in these sort of structural dynamics, and I think conferences is a really interesting one in relation to that. I mean, I can't actually afford to go to mindfulness conferences anymore, because I sort of live in a sort of economic precarity of being a mindfulness teacher, and sometimes it feels a little bit like some means to accessing conferences become inaccessible. But what we did a few years ago with Stephen Stanley, and he mentioned it on the podcast you did with him, was we tried to create a way in which to come together to sort of design a space where people could share their work on mindfulness in a way that was purposefully non-hierarchical and gave everybody sort of equal access to the floor, if you like, to the mic. Rather than this sort of trend, which is very popular around sort of keynotes and certain voices getting more time, or getting greater audiences. We wanted to see what it would be like to develop something sort of that would provide not only space to speak, but also a space to decide what do we even talk about. So the way we went about setting that up, and we did this with Rachel Lilly, Meg John Barker, Stephen Stanley, Alison Armstrong, Luke Wreford, and myself. Was that we just asked people, what do you want to bring to the conference? We're going to have this one. We called it an unconference. We're going to have an unconference, and what do you want to bring? What do you want to talk about? And from that, 16 people of the 32 or 35, or actually might have been even 40 people who came in the end, they offered what they wanted to talk about. We grouped it together into topics, and then we gave them time on the basis of how many people wanted to speak. And so it's just an example of how, like, the process that you use can start to already address structural inequalities that sometimes show up, and voices that don't get heard, or points of view that don't get heard, or critique that doesn't get heard. And it was actually at that unconference that we had a whole session on racism within the mindfulness movement, and that's how I started to do my own personal work on my own racialization as a white person. So I think that kind of work it's so vital, but it only comes when you really allow yourself to be exposed and be in relationship with others, and sort of be able to see what sort of system you're part of. And I think a mindfulness practice can help with that. That's what I feel is the sort of liberating nature of mindfulness practice, is to recognize the way in which we are part of the system, and have more choice about how we are with each other, how we relate with each other, and how we become more equal and just, and create structures and systems that create more equality and justice for everybody, not just for some. But you have to be able to see that you're part of it. I think that's the key thing. And it was interesting reading Michael Edwards' summary of all of those transformation articles, and he picks up on that point. And I think I agree with him that as you talk about a lot in your book, Ron, the need to sort of understand the social, cultural, political, economic context within which suffering is happening. The causes of suffering at that level, that's part of it. But it's also about seeing how we ourselves are part of that. We as teachers, or we as people who head up mindfulness organizations or head up movements, how we are also part of it. And there's this need to sort of be doing that, some work on ourselves to be able to see that. And you can only really do that when you're interacting, when you're realizing our relationality with each other.
So you have kind of come up with a new curriculum for teaching mindfulness, if I'm correct, that embeds mindfulness in a much wider framework. It's not just a clinical, psychological approach to mindfulness, right?
Yeah, I mean, we at the ULEX project, I was really lucky. I was really fortunate enough to have the space and the support from G to think about how we might teach mindfulness in a way, teach a more sort of social form of mindfulness, which they had been doing already, but like a really explicit program on mindfulness and social change. So, I mean, we actually, the way we sort of think about it is we developed a sort of A to D quadrant, I call it, sort of. So if you can imagine on the one side you've got a sort of well, let's say on the bottom you've got the sort of business as usual, and that's thinking about the social context of sort of business as usual sort of context, capitalism, consumerism, neoliberalism that we're all subjected to, sort of the way in which we interact with our environment at the moment, which is unsustainable. And then at the top, you've got this sort of positive new reality that we want to work towards, which has this economic and social and environmental justice within it. And then on either side, on the right, you would have a sort of mindful approach, and then on the left of the quadrant, you would have a sort of autopilot approach. And so if you can imagine, then that sort of creates these sort of four quadrants. And so what we tried to do at the ULEX project is think, okay, so we recognize that there's critique around mainstream mindfulness, and you lay out a lot of that critique in your books, in the mindfulness, but also in the other books. You put together something, mindfulness, the handbook of mindfulness, cultures,
context and social engagement.
And social engagement, yeah. So these sorts of concerns, and the risk there, I guess, is that you get down in this quadrant of sort of mindful, but not transformative of business as usual. But we also wanted to appreciate that on the other side, where you are working towards positive new reality, if you're not doing the inner work, there can also be problems in that quadrant as well. So activists or change makers working towards positive sort of social change, that there can still be some issues there. So you can still reproduce the old order. You can still reproduce sort of power dynamics within these spaces. You can still have a lot of conflict between organizations and between movements, and ways in which that conflict it doesn't get addressed and then uses a lot of energy. You can still have burnout, and you can still be very attached to identities and still, have your own sort of dogma, and you can still be really fixated on this sort of doing. So we try to think about a way of creating a view of mindfulness as sort of a mindful social change, which is more embedded in the integration of the inner and outer work, the things like being resilient and collaborating effectively, and having empathy and compassion and skillful communication, and thinking about time and how long change takes, and our need to think about ourselves as part of a longer term process rather than the change happening now, and how to embody values and reduce what's called the value action gap between the values that we have and actually what we do. So that was the idea, that we would develop a course that covered sort of those that had sort of that perspective.
That's great. I'm thinking one of the takeaways from mindfulness is that practice of becoming less attached to one's own perspective, opinions, judgments, and so on. So that's definitely inner work to let go of, and to notice when one is so attached to one's own beliefs. And the other thing you mentioned, I thought about how activists tend to say, well, yeah, we have to do, and we have to produce, and we have to achieve. And that's kind of an outer analysis of neoliberalism, where you're only judged by how much you're producing and how much output you have and so on. So there's really a connection between the two.
And just the importance of process. It's not just about the goal, it's about the process of how you get to the goal. And that's where your values can really come out. But sometimes you get so focused on the goal that actually you don't have a process that builds relationships, for example, and actually doesn't embody your values. So we have a sort of a little three circles that we use: task, process, relationship, and a lot of it is about working through the importance of those three elements.
I want to bring up an issue that relates to your model. You made the point that if you're only working on social change, if you're a social activist and not paying attention to the inner work, I think, I wonder, I don't know if you're familiar with a very controversial comedian here by the name of Bill Maher in the United States. He was known for a program he had, a long-running program called Politically Incorrect, and now he has a program called Real Time. But he has become sort of notorious for being critical of sort of the extremism on the left. He has been talking a lot about performative wokeness and how white people are suddenly almost culturally appropriating how mad white people are about racism, that it may kind of appear like a tedious form of virtue signaling. And I'm wondering, and do you think that maybe that has something to do with this idea that the inner work is not occurring, and that there is sort of this intolerance or the extremism that's playing out in identity politics?
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understood your question, but certainly virtue signaling is something that we have to do work on, I think, if we're looking at our identity. As soon as we start to sort of notice that there's as soon as we start to sort of be aware of a difficult area, then any work that we do towards that can sort of give rise to this sort of sense of, like you said, this sort of sense of wokeness, or I'm now doing the work. and obviously that can just fall very much back into the same problem of not really being willing to do the sort of deeper work of things like dropping the mic, let's say, of actually sometimes not being the person to speak or to give the space to somebody else or to, well, whatever it might be, and actually just what they call the sort of ally cookies, which I think comes with the territory of doing that work, and that's where I think mindfulness practice is so important for helping us to see how that's arising, and that sort of the desire to be a good person, a good white person, plays out. But I'm sorry, not familiar with the comedian and his work.
Well, one of the areas this plays out is on Twitter, and it's often referred to as cancel culture.
Oh yeah,
where there is this kind of very reactive, very swift and severe punishing and retribution for any perceived wrongs, and it's almost like an intolerance of any kind of critique or opposing views, or someone didn't get it right the first time perhaps, and there's kind of this public shaming.
Well, this is a problem with the medium, I think. I just don't know if these conversations can really happen over a medium like Twitter. And I think that takes us back to this conversation we're talking about building capacity and about change and transformative change. And that, that doesn't happen through a Twitter feed. Although Layla Saad, I should say, did a very successful Twitter feed on me and my white supremacy, which had thousands and thousands of participants. So obviously Twitter can have a difference, but actually having decent substantive conversations about this where people can really start to see see different viewpoints, understand their the ways that they've been socialized that might not have realized. It's difficult to do that work. It's painful to see yourself in it. It's painful to deal with shame, and you can't do that through commentary on Twitter. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a determined effort. So that's the type of change that I'm interested in.
I'd like to ask you another question. What was your reaction to Trump getting COVID?
I mean, it is a really interesting one, because I'm really interested in. I'm interested in systemic change, and the best change for the world right now would be Trump not being the president, not having the power that he has, and let's hope that happens in the next election. And that would be a very democratic and way of that change happening, and that would be the best way of that change happening, because it would show that people had changed their mind about what they wanted. They would have seen the sorts of politics that was happening, and they would have chosen a different option. And I think that's what's important, is to remember that as much as Trump sort of epitomizes so many of the things that we can't stand, he has been elected. And so it's there's a lot of work to do in terms of understanding why that happened, and I don't mean to avoid answering the question. Obviously, I'm thinking about that he has to go for the sake of literally, I think at this point, literally for the sake of humanity. I mean, climate change is the greatest threat to us, and we need the climate agreements. We need to hold governments to account. Governments collectively need to be held account. America has to be, right up there making that kind of change happen. So we need a president that will do that. It's so frustrating. And then COVID comes along, and just classic Trump. He's now rattling off this narrative of it not being such a big deal, and how he's as hard to steal, and it's very frustrating. I actually have been on a news diet for about 5 weeks now. It's really helping my sense of hope and my sense of well-being. And so this happened, and I tell you what, it was the most difficult moment of being on a news diet was when I found out Trump had COVID, and I was desperate to go and look and read all the articles and understand what was happening. And I I'm really glad I didn't, because I don't think that is a good roller coaster to go up and down. And I want a fair election, and for the people to choose a way forward that's best for Americans, and obviously for for the world.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast the other day on the Chauncey DeVega show. He was interviewing Dr. Cornel West and about our reactions to Trump getting COVID. And Dr. West said, well, it's really tempting to kind of stoop to his level and become kind of your inner Trump just kind of comes out and wishes him to be dead. And he says, we really can't stoop to that, but it is a form of accountability. I mean, he does need to be held accountable, and in a way, him getting COVID was a form of accountability. So I don't think we should be...
For sure, he wasn't following the medical guidance. He wasn't following, the laws that he had set up himself. I mean, I think accountability is a good word to use in that case.
Well, Paula, this was a great conversation. Really enjoyed exploring the innovative work you've been doing, especially in the Mindfulness and Social Change Network and ULIX and Ecodharma, and really enjoyed it. And I think we'll make all these resources available on our website for people to do a little further exploration. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Yep.
Thank you. And the network really is a space for lots of other people. I mean, there are lots of people doing really, really innovative work. And if you go onto the website, you can see some examples of that type of work. So it's not just me. There's many others. So I hope you'll have more opportunities to share the sort of breadth of social mindfulness work that's happening worldwide. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks, Paula. It was terrific.
I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Mindful Cranks. You could check us out on iTunes, the Apple Store, Google Play, SoundCloud, and many other podcast platforms. Please do leave a review if you feel so inclined. It does help us on iTunes and Apple Store. And we have a Facebook page, a Twitter page. You can always go to our website, mindfulcranks.com, to see what's coming up, as well as to read some of our articles that are posted on that website. We plan soon on actually creating a Patreon page. We haven't gotten there yet, but soon we will be reaching out to see if you want to throw a few bucks to help with production costs and subscriptions to our basic servers and things like that. Thank you again, and we really enjoyed talking with Paula Haddock from Oxford, the United Kingdom.